Il figlio da quale...
What question?
Ha parlato di un figlio, da quale marito?
A son, my son. Ah, okay. Oh, because I said it, I'm sorry. I am really sorry because I said it very quickly. My daughter, Mona Helmi, who is a writer and poet in Egypt, she lives in Egypt, she's a writer. She is the daughter of my first husband, Dr. Ahmed Helmi. That's the first husband. The second husband, I have no children. I didn't want any memory of him, of the judge. Then Sharif, the third husband, I have a son with the third husband. His name is Atif Hetata, and he's a film director. In fact, he graduated, he was an engineer, the top of the engineering college, but he didn't want to be an engineer, he wanted to go and make films. So he became a film director. So that's the son from the third husband. In fact, we are a very, very strange family, atypical family, strange, because Sharif is a physician. He was the top of the medical college, and he left medicine and went into politics and landed in prison. He was a dissident rebellion for years in prison. My daughter, she had her PhD in political economy, and she threw her PhD in the garbage, and she started writing poetry and short stories, and she writes for the cinema now. My son, he was also the top of the engineering college, and he didn't want to be an engineer. He went to film. I also graduated from the medical college, and I didn't want to be a medical doctor. So it's a very strange family. But I think it's very useful because we combine science and art. In fact, there is no separation between what we call science and art. They are one. I don't find any contradiction between medicine and literature, between fiction and nonfiction. I write both. I write fiction and nonfiction. They are one. They are inseparable. And I teach since 1993. I teach in the United States and in other universities, like in Spain and other universities. I teach a topic which I call creativity and dissidence. The relationship between being creative and being dissident, and the relationship between science and art, and between medicine and literature and politics. We cannot separate. And I gave a course, I think this was in Seattle, in the United States. I gave one course which I called fiction and nonfiction writing. And I said there is no separation between what we call fiction and what we call nonfiction. Because there is no separation between the body, the mind, and the spirit. They are one. So we cannot really separate. And as a psychiatrist, I don't separate between psychological diseases and physical diseases. That's why we call it psychosomatic diseases. Psychosomatic means physical and psychological disease. They are one. You cannot separate. You cannot cut the head from the body, you know. They are one.
Poi volevo chiedere se nella sua famiglia si praticava l'infibulazione, e in particolare se lei ha subito l'infibulazione.
The word infabulation means different from circumcision, because there are different types of female genital mutilation or male genital mutilation. In fact, infabulation is more or less the Sudanese type, the Sudanese, in which is very serious, because they cut the clitoris, the labia minora, the labia majora, all the external organs, they cut it, and then they suture the wound and leave a small orifice for the menstrual blood and urine, you know. The first time I examined a Sudanese woman, I was horrified from the disfigurement of the genital organs. So this is called infabulation. In Egypt, it is cutting only the clitoris. They call it the sunnah type, the sunnah. It's just to cut the clitoris. And in some families, they cut only part of the clitoris, the tip of the clitoris. In my family, they cut the whole clitoris, as was done to me, and to my mother, and to my sisters. But my daughter, I prevented that, you know. And since I wrote my book, many families started not to circumcise their daughters. So infabulation does not apply to the Egyptian type. It applies to the Sudanese type. But male circumcision is also against the health, but many people are silent about that, which is grave also.
Speak a little bit more about what you're teaching, your courses at Duke University.
I didn't hear about what? About what? Say it again.
Sorry, if you could speak about your courses, the courses that you're teaching.
About what? The course.
The courses that you're teaching.
The courses,
a little bit more,
yes. Mm-hmm. Well, most of the courses which I have been teaching since 1993 till now, 2008, I gave it the title Creativity and Dissidence. And under this title, I teach many topics. But usually, my whole teaching is based on certain points. Number one, that you cannot teach creativity and you cannot teach dissidence. You know, the first time I meet my students, I tell them that, you know, you do not expect me to teach you creativity or dissidence. What I can do is to undo what education and religion did to you, you know. So I try to undo what happened to our mind, because I'm not speaking about Egypt. This is global. This is universal. We lose our creativity in schools and in the teaching of religion, in churches, in mosques. The way we are taught religion, the way we are taught in schools, we lose our creativity because we become obedient to God. We are afraid. They say, you know, they use the word God-fearing. When you say, this person is God-fearing, means he's very good. So, as if to be afraid is good, and fear is the antithesis of creativity. Creativity is based on courage, to be brave, to go beyond the limits, to have a critical mind, to be able to criticize God and your father and your president, to be able to criticize anybody because you are not afraid. But if you are God-fearing and you are afraid of God and afraid of hellfire, how can you be creative, you know? So I start with this. I start to undo to my students many of the conceptions that we inherited from religion, from parents, from society, from good manners to behave well. I tell them, don't behave well. Because we are born in fear, and we live in fear, and we die in fear. And that's why we lose our creativity. So my courses, that's number one. I try to undo the fear. And then connection. I have to help them to connect politics, economics, global, local, you know, all that.
Che punto? Che domande avete fatto? Ah? Ok. Allora riprendiamo a pomeriggio? Sì.
Io volevo chiedere se durante la pratica come psichiatra utilizzava i farmaci, oppure no.
No. No. I don't use drugs. I don't. Of course, I know that chemistry is our mind. There are a lot of chemistry here. We cannot ignore that, because our body, there is a lot of chemistry, there are a lot of electricity, a lot of electromagnetic waves in our bodies. Our body, I don't believe in spirituality. I do not separate the spirit from the mind, from the body. They are one. They are one. So I must believe in chemistry, of course. But from my experience, and that's the difference between me and many of my colleagues, my psychiatrists. I have many colleagues in Egypt who use drugs all the time, antidepressants. You know, it's very, and in the United States, you know, I think that it's lazy doctors who use drugs because it's easy. The patient comes, and he or she is depressed, and I write a prescription, and that's it. And the patient stays 10 or 15 minutes or half an hour with the doctor, and that's it. For me, I don't do that. And that's why I am not a regular psychiatrist. I closed my clinic. I am more of a writer. I take very, very few cases, because sometimes I can stay 2 hours with one person, 2 hours. So this cannot work. I do not live economically from my medical profession, no. Economically, I live from my writing, because I am very much against living on the sweat and blood of patients coming to my clinic. I am against that. And I tried with many of my colleagues in Egypt to change the medical law and the relationship between the doctors and the patients, which is very exploitative The medical profession is very commercial, and I try to be away from that. Because once there is money between the doctor and the patient, there is something wrong here. So that's why I cannot be a regular doctor. I cannot live if I take patients. I take very, very few patients, and I don't charge them money unless they are very rich. But many of the patients who come to me are poor and young students, women students oppressed, or some young men who are oppressed. They come to me with depression or other symptoms. So I have to talk to them, to stay 1 hour, 2 hours, like that, to have a conversation about their childhood, their life, their relationship with the mother, the father, and why they have depression. Why? And, you know, so the more I talk with them, I'll tell you something also very important. Because I don't charge money, so they feel relaxed, you know? When you go to a doctor and you feel that he is looking to his watch every minute, and every minute means money to him or to her, then you feel a bit uncomfortable. But the patient, when sits with me, he feels he is sitting with a friend. He's not sitting with a doctor. I try to abolish the patient-doctor relationship. And that's why I take very, very few patients. I cannot work like that regularly. But I use my psychiatry for my writing and, you know, to understand the psyche, the human being. That's why I don't try drugs at all. If I feel that a patient needs chemistry, I refer him to some of my, or her, to some of the psychiatrists I have confidence in. Because I myself am against giving drugs. Number one, it makes habit. You depend on it. And then when you stop it, you have problems with withdrawal. It's a lot of many things. And also the causes of depression is not always chemistry. It is social, political, economic. It has something to do with the society, not with the chemistry of the brain.
Va bene. Riprendiamo. Riprendiamo 14:30.
So we have how many?
Allora, riprendiamo. Allora, com'era la vita nel villaggio, poi la vita sua e degli abitanti? Quindi nel villaggio, poi ad Alessandria, poi a Menuf e poi a Cairo, nei vari quartieri in cui lei è stata. com'era la vita sociale e civile. Ok.
Yes. So if we start with the village,
Sì.
the village was very poor. And my grandmother, the mother of my father, was one of the poor peasants who was working very hard to provide for her 7 children, 1 son and 6 daughters. Of course, the culture of the social and economic and cultural life of the village was very, very backward. For instance, I give example. My grandmother, who was a rebellion against the king and against the British, she didn't send her daughters to school. The 6 daughters stayed in the village, and they worked with her in the field to send my father to school. So my father, who was the only boy, he had the privilege to go to Cairo to school and then to Al-Azhar, and to move from the poor peasant class to the middle class. Who sacrificed for that? The 6 sisters, his 6 sisters, and his mother. And that's why my father was able to marry my mother, who came from a better class, because of the sacrifice of his mother and sisters. So the social and cultural and economic situation in the village was not in favor of women. It was favor of the men, of boys. And that was, I was lucky to leave the village, because if I stayed in the village, I could have been like my aunts. I could have been married when I am 10, and that's it. But I was lucky that my father went to Alexandria, to the city, where I was exposed to another culture. In Alexandria, it's a relatively progressive city by the Mediterranean, affected by the universal culture. I was in school, so I was exposed to a better situation in Alexandria. And because I was very good in school, I loved school. School for me was liberation from the home, and liberation from poverty, liberation to go away. And also Alexandria at that time, during 1936, there was a mass movement against the British, a lot of demonstrations in the streets. I remember when I was a little child, I saw a lot of people in the streets shouting against the king, against the British, and my father was one of them. He was in the street demonstrating. He was a school teacher, and he was demonstrating with the students in the streets against the government and against the British. That's why the government punished him. And they sent him from Alexandria to Munuf, which is a village. It's better than the village where I was born, but it's different from Alexandria. So the government punished my father because he participated in the mass movement, and they sent him to Munuf, where the culture and the social and the economic was relatively backward relative to Alexandria. After 10 years, because my father went to Munuf in 1938. In 1948, he spent 10 years in Munuf without any promotion. The government didn't promote him, punishment for him. Until 1948, he went to Cairo.
Al Cairo. E dunque, ma la vita, la vita com'era a quell'epoca ad Alessandria, cioè non la sua vita, la vita anche com'era la vita sociale e civile, no? Ad Alessandria e poi al Cairo, perché a Cairo lei è stata in diversi quartieri, quindi anche lungo le epoche la città come il Cairo dagli anni 40 a oggi si è trasformata moltissimo, no? Quindi anche questo può essere molto interessante.
Yes. In fact, Alexandria, as I said, was relatively progressive, and the mass movement, the student movement, the workers, there was the worker union in Alexandria. There were the teachers, the low classes in the government. All this united and demonstrated. So there was a social movement, a political movement, a political protest against poverty, against British colonialism, against the king, and against slavery. But up at that moment, I was not yet aware of any women movement, any feminist movement in Egypt. But in Cairo, I came to Cairo, or my father came to Cairo in 1948, and I entered the medical college in 1949. In the medical college, we had different classes, of course. There were the very rich, because the medical college, in fact, nobody could enter the medical college easily. I entered the medical college because I had high grades. So in Egypt, the faculties or education depend on how many grades you have. So the highest faculty in Egypt is the medical college, and then the engineering. They call it first-class colleges. It's the students who have the highest grades who go to the medical college. And that's why I went to the medical college, because I was the top of my class. So I went to the medical college, and in spite I was female, because at that time in the United States, in America, if I was born in America, and if I graduated in America in 1949, I will never enter the medical college, because there was a quota for the black people and the quota for women to enter the medical college in the United States. But in Egypt, we were more progressive. The people, the students who entered the medical college who have the highest grades. And that's why I entered. Because many people tell me, how did you become a medical doctor? I became a medical doctor, though I was poor. My father couldn't pay. I had scholarship, because my father could not pay for me in the medical college. It had very high fees. And the books, I got a scholarship because I had very high grades. So that's why I entered the medical college. Of course, in the medical college, I met the upper classes, the very rich people, students who were rich, and the middle class, and very few people coming from the poor classes who had scholarship. Those were very few people. So the civil society in Cairo at that time, during the 40s, from 1949, 1950, 1951, those 3 years were very radical, very important, because the revolution, what we call July Revolution of 1952, came because of the demonstrations. I remember in those 3 years in Cairo, just before the revolution, I was almost in the street every day. Demonstration against the king, against the British, against slavery, against poverty. And many students were killed. Many students, my colleagues, many of my colleagues in the medical college were killed in the streets during 1950. And also January 1951. And then January 1952. And there was also the war in Suez Canal. So some of the students went to fight the British, volunteered. One of them, my first husband, the father of my daughter. He left the medical college, he went to Suez Canal to fight the British. And that's why he lost 2 years from the medical college fighting the British in the canal. And then we have something very important, the day when Cairo was burnt, حريق القاهرة. It was January 1952, just before the revolution. The revolution happened in July 1952. In January 1952, Cairo was burnt. Who burned Cairo? It was an historical event. We were in the streets and I remember the flames and the fire coming from the buildings in Cairo. So what happened? That the British and the king collaborated to burn Cairo, to arrest the guerrilla fighters, because they wanted to stop the revolution, stop the demonstrations, and they didn't find any way except to burn and to accuse the opposition and to accuse the students and the people who were in the demonstration, to accuse them of the fire. And that's why after the fire, the government collected all the revolutionary students and revolutionary young men and put them in prisons. And this is one of the very, very cruel events which affected my first husband. Because my first husband, we were engaged at that time. He was my fiancé, not yet my husband. We were engaged, we were having the rings only. And he left the medical college, he went fighting the British, and then the government, what we call the betrayal of the government of Egypt betrayed the students and the guerrilla fighters and burnt Cairo, and then put all those young people in prison, and some of them died in the canal. Some of them died psychologically because of the betrayal. And my husband was one of them who suffered psychologically very much because of these events, especially the burning of Cairo. And then in 23 July 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser and the army people started to make the revolution and to dismiss the king. He came to Italy. He came to Capoli, what's the name? Capri, what? It's a place, it's a mina by the sea. It's called what? I don't remember. So the king Farouk, because the army took power from the king, and they put the king on a ship with his family and with his jewelry and told him, go to Italy. So he went to Italy, and he died in Italy. King Farouk. Yeah. So these were the political and social uprisal in Egypt. So I was really brought up in a very critical period, and this affected me politically.
poi dopo, quindi Nasser prende il potere e poi dopo la vita si trasforma.
After Nasser, yes, Nasser. Nasser came to power after the revolution of 1952. Yes, Nasser came to power till he died in 1970, after the defeat, the very big defeat of 1967. This was the big defeat of Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Egypt. The three countries were defeated by the British, the Americans, the French, and the Israeli. 4 countries, American, British, Israeli, and the French. It's the big war in 1967, and the 3 Arab countries, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, were defeated totally.
Ma la vita man mano al Cairo si trasformava, lei andava avanti con gli studi, poi la facoltà di medicina, poi il lavoro nell'ospedale, ma la città si trasformava di anno in anno, no? C'era una trasformazione culturale, una trasformazione non soltanto politica, ma anche culturale.
Yes, very much. In fact, the Nasser regime was much, much progressive relative to Sadat when he came after 1970. So Nasser tried, they called him even a communist. He was not a communist. He was a socialist, even not very much a socialist. He wanted to diminish the gap between the rich and the poor, because the society in Egypt at that time, we called it the 20% society. So 20% of the Egyptians were millionaires, multi-billionaires, and 98% of the people were poor.
2%. 2% erano milionari, 98% poveri, poverissimi.
Yes, you see the difference, and that's why we called it, and that's why the revolution happened, because it would never go like that 90% of the people are starving to live and working just to live, and we were, my family, one of them. And the 2% of the Egyptians had more millionaires, and the family of the king, one of them, the family of the king, and few families, they owned everything. And 98% of the people owned nothing. So the revolution happened. Nasser tried to diminish the gap between the rich and the poor. And that's why he succeeded, and people loved him. He said, now we have to end the social disease, poverty, ignorance, and disease, the triad, we call it, poverty, ignorance, and disease. This triad was a chronic disease in Egypt. So Nasser, when Nasser came to power, he said, we have to eradicate poverty, ignorance, and disease. I was a medical doctor in 1955, and I worked as a physician in the village. And 90% of the peasants were sick of bilharziosis. They bled blood in the urine because of the tropical disease, bilharziosis. And peasants die very young when they were 30 because of the bilharziosis. So this was a chronic disease in Egypt, bilharziosis. and ignorance, because people didn't have money to go to school. I went to school because I had a scholarship, but I was among the very few who had scholarships. But many of the women and men in my class, they didn't go to university. They didn't go to school. So the illiteracy rate was 90%, 90 or very high, the illiteracy. And then poverty. Poverty was great. Peasants were starving. So Nasser came with this social movement, what we called socialism. But it was not really socialism. He was afraid because the bourgeois power was great, and also the people, the bourgeois and the upper classes, had connection with the British, the French, and the Americans. So they were supported by external powers. And this brought the defeat, in fact. They tried to kill Nasser. And what happened also that's very important about religion, that the Muslim brothers, the Islamic groups in Egypt, the Muslim brothers, collaborated with the British against Nasser. And even they tried to kill Nasser. Nasser in Alexandria in I have to remember the year. He was making a speech and they shot him. And he just escaped. The Muslim brothers with the British and the French and the Americans tried to kill Nasser in Alexandria in one of his meetings, and he escaped. And that's why Nasser put the Muslim brothers in prison.
Quindi è avvenuta questo movimento fondamentalista dei fratelli musulmani è stato favorito per un certo tempo dalle potenze straniere.
Of course, of course. The Muslim brothers, since 1980s, since the early of the 20th century, 1980s and 1930s,
Agli anni 20 agli anni 30.
They were supported by the British colonialists in Egypt, like bin Laden. Usually, usually I say George Bush and bin Laden are twins. They are two faces of the same coin. The American government created the bin Laden groups to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. This was during the 80s. The same happened in Egypt during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, before the revolution, that the British, and during Nasser, the British supported the Islamic groups, the Muslim brothers in Egypt, to fight Nasser. To fight Nasser. You see the danger of the religious groups. And also, the mechanism, we have to know the mechanism of the colonial power, the British, and the neo-colonial power, the American.
Qual era lo scopo dei fratelli musulmani? Qual è stato il progetto dei fratelli musulmani da quando questo movimento è nato fino a oggi? Perché i fratelli musulmani sono stati sempre presenti, no? In varie epoche, fino a oggi, anche oggi sono presenti. Qual è il loro progetto? Qual è stato il loro progetto nei vari periodi?
In fact, they have a very, very complex goal because they have no program. They have no social program. they have what say Islamic program. So when you ask them, what's your program? Because I have many people, I know them in the Muslim Brothers, and they were put in prison, in fact, with the Marxists. So my husband lived 10 years with the Muslim Brothers in prison because Nasser put the Marxists and the Muslim Brothers in prison together, because the Muslim Brothers tried to kill him, and they were supported by the British. The Marxists were not satisfied with his social program, because he was not really a socialist. So the two enemies of Nasser were the Muslim Brothers and the Marxists, the communists and the Muslims. So he put them in prison, and my husband spent 10 years under Nasser in prison with the Muslim Brothers. So they know each other quite well. So in fact, the Muslim Brother movement, it has a lot of power now in Egypt, now. And they played a role against me. They played the role to provoke some of the fundamentalist lawyers to make a case against me in court, which I won just 2 days ago. And they did that with many intellectuals, many poets, many writers, the Muslim Brothers. And they hide under a facade that they are moderate. They say they are moderate. They are not fanatic like bin Laden and all that, but they are fanatic. But they hide under a facade of being moderate, you know. They are moderate. But they work with the Americans, and they work with the British, and they work with all external powers under the title of Islam, and also the Christian, because we have the Christian fundamentalist movement in Egypt also, encouraged by Sadat. I'll come to that, because Sadat encouraged both the Islamic fundamentalists, the Muslim Brothers, and the Christian fundamentalists in Egypt after the death of Nasser in 1970. I'll give you an example. For instance, in the medical college, there was, when I was a student, there was not a single veiled student in the whole university. We were all like that. Not a veiled, there was no fanatism. And women were encouraged to go to school, to be in the arts, etc. Under Sadat, my daughter, Mona, she was a student in university. 30% of the students, the female students, were veiled. Veiling increased. Female circumcision increased. Fanatism, obscurantism, all religious fundamentalist ideas came under Sadat with the help of the Americans.
Fratelli musulmani.
And Muslim Brothers. And the Muslim Brothers all the time, whenever we have a revival of religion, the Muslim Brothers are there. And today, in fact, I'll speak about today, but now we have to go back to, you asked me about the role? Yes.
Sui fratelli musulmani.
The role of the Muslim Brothers. So the Muslim Brothers, if we ask them, what's your program? They have no program. They say, Islam. Our program is Islam. Our program is Sharia. Our program is the Quran. The Quran is our constitution. So we tell them, what's in the Quran? There is nothing in the Quran. No, you know, the Quran, like the Bible, like all the holy books, it's general ideas. There is no program, no political, economic program. So it's a lot of lies. It's lies, you know. They have no program, except that they are fanatic. They want to take power. They veil women. And they interpret Islam in a very backward way, because Islam, my father was a Muslim. My father, he was an Islamic scholar, teacher, graduated from Azhar. He never veiled us. He sent me to the medical college. You know, he was very enlightened. But the Muslim Brothers is the most backward interpretation of Islam.
Hanno paura delle donne? I fratelli musulmani hanno paura delle donne?
They are afraid of women. They hate women. They despise women. Like Christian fundamentalists, like Jewish fundamentalists, because women are despised in the 3 holy books. If you study the Old Testament, if you study the New Testament, if you study the Quran, and I studied the 3 books and compare, women are despised. Eve is a sinner, though she was the female goddess of knowledge. She ate from the tree of knowledge, but she was the sinner, the bad woman. There is a lot of racism in the 3 holy books. The conception of the infidel. What do you mean by infidel? This is a conception in the 3 monotheistic religions. The infidel means the person who do not believe in my God and should be killed. So the conception of infidel, the inferiority position of women, racism, fanatism, class oppression in the 3 holy books. Because women and slaves are very despised in the 3 holy books. So in fact, the Muslim Brothers reflect this. The Muslim Brothers veil women, circumcise women, hate women. They call me the devil. My name is the White Devil because of my white hair. So they call me the White Devil, you know, the Muslim Brothers. So anybody who differ with them is the devil, you know. But this is a conception in the 3.
E quindi loro fanno ricorso anche al tribunale, diventano giustizialisti.
Yes, that's a new phenomena. This is one of the very new phenomena. Because the Muslim Brothers, they had a military wing. They used to assassinate people, to kill people who are different from them. They had a military wing. They cannot, when they cannot use the military wing, they use the cultural wing, the court. They go to court. If they cannot, I am on the death list, but if they cannot kill intellectuals, they take them to court and sabotage them. They have newspaper, but this is since Sadat, because Sadat gave them permission to have papers, to have newspapers, to have magazines, to be in the media. So the Muslim Brothers and the fundamentalist Islamic and Christian groups in Egypt used the media against the intellectuals. They portrayed us as the devils, as somebody who is going to corrupt Islam, who is going to betray the country, that we should be deprived of our nationality. In the last case, they said, this just came to me today, because I won the case just on the 13th of May. So 3 days ago, I won the case against the Muslim Brothers and the fundamentalists. And some of the progressive newspapers and writers in Egypt sent me faxes, congratulations, saying, Nawal El Saadawi, welcome back to Egypt, you know, after I won the case. So they used the court against us. And if you read this article, you see how they distorted my image in the media, in the newspaper, so that all Egyptian people will say, oh,